Hello, everyone. I'm Ray Kozlowski, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Master of International Affairs program here at the University at Albany. Welcome to our roundtable discussion on building higher education and workforce pipelines for resettled refugees. I'd like to first thank Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy and the School of Education for sponsoring this roundtable. And I'd also like to thank their staff for promoting the event, and especially to Kelly Hammond, Rockefeller College's Director of Alumni Relations, who handled registration and is now managing this Zoom session. So over the next 90 minutes, we'll discuss how US institutions of higher education can help refugees transition to living and working in the US. Universities, four-year colleges, and community colleges might propel workforce development by assisting refugees, and how educational pipelines might give refugee children access to higher education, professional career opportunities. So a few words about how we're going to proceed. So as a moderator, I'll pose the lead question posted on the agenda to each member of the roundtable, who will then have up to 5 minutes to answer. Other members may then chime in on the topic for another few minutes before we move on to the lead question for our next participant. Many of you in the audience submitted questions when you registered for the event, and I'll try to work in some of these questions depending on the pace and the flow of the discussion. Once all of the roundtable members have answered their lead questions, I'll pose additional questions submitted with registration. Now, audience members, you may also submit questions to the roundtable via the chat function, which the roundtable members may then opt to answer. After our formal roundtable ends at 3 o'clock, I'll stay on the Zoom session and try to answer more questions for anybody who wants to hang around, and try to help make some connections and moderate any discussion that emerges. Now, there are links to the bios of our roundtable participants in the event announcement, but I'd like to now briefly introduce our roundtable in the order of the agenda. Bernhard Streitwieser is Associate Professor of International Education and International Affairs at George Washington University. His most recent book is Higher Education in the Era of Migration, Displacement, and Internationalization. Amy Lloyd is Senior Advisor in the Office of the Secretary of the US Department of Education, and she leads the Department of Education's efforts in education for Afghan resettlement across P through 12 and higher education. Enia Nasir is a Fulbright Scholar from Afghanistan and the University at Albany's Master of Science in Education Policy and Leadership program. Before arriving in Albany this past August, he worked over a decade with educational NGOs and policy analysis, strategic planning, and management. Sarah Dryden Peterson is an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and author of the forthcoming book, Right Where We Belong: How Refugee Teachers and Students Are Changing the Future of Education. Laura Gonzalez Murphy is Director for Immigration Policy and Research at the New York Department of State, and also served as Director of the New York State Office for New Americans. She's also an alum, having received her PhD in political science from Rockefeller College. Miriam Feldblum is co-author and executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. She previously served as Vice President for Student Affairs, Dean of Students, and Professor of Politics at Pomona College. Dia Abdo is Professor of English at Guilford College. She is also the founder and director of the national campus-based refugee resettlement program, Every Campus a Refuge. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn to our roundtable and begin asking our lead questions here. So, Bernhard, what are the biggest barriers to refugees accessing higher education in the US, and how can these barriers be overcome?
Great. Well, hi, Ray, and fellow panelists. So nice to be on the call today, and hello to the audience as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just say a couple of things before I get right into answering the question. Displacement for anyone affected is, above all else, a personal disaster with devastating physical and psychological implications. For those who are of adult age, it's also very likely a disaster with devastating educational and longer-term professional ramifications. So we need to understand the totality of what this means for someone who is unfortunate enough to go through displacement. Another point to put into context today, to put the refugee issues in appropriate context, we see the Second World War, a calamity that's now 77 years in our rearview mirror, being used again as a measure to size up the variety of current day disasters we're seeing. For example, the displacement of refugee numbers as cited by the UNHCR refers to it as the highest since the end of the Second World War. Stephanie Giannini, the UNESCO Assistant Director General for Education, explains in her interview recently that the pandemic has caused the biggest disruption to education since the Second World War. And the current crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and its horrific refugee crisis, which has now displaced upward of 10 million Ukrainians, is also regularly referred to in the media as the largest and worst conflict on the continent since World War II, after the Balkan crisis in the 90s, the worst refugee crisis since 1945, and now also tragically witness to the worst human rights violations since the 1930s and 1940s. So we're seeing World War II reemerge as this benchmark for what we're seeing happening today in really devastating ways. So in terms of education, the challenges for entry into higher education for students of refugee background, which is the term I prefer to use and became accustomed to in my research in Germany, those obstacles are many. Right now, the percentage of refugees resettled in a third country every year is only 1%, according to the UNHCR, 1%. And only about 5% manage to get in and find a way to pursue higher education. That's up from previously 3% and before that 1%. But still, there's a lot of work to be done. It's still very low to the 39% among non-refugee students. So hopefully the UNHCR's 15 by 30 program focused on raising enrollment figures to 15% by 2030 will help change those numbers, but the challenges really are very great. So as Khalid Arar, a collaborator of mine on the book that Ray mentioned in his introduction, have sketched out, as we've sketched out, there are sort of 5 buckets of challenges that refugees face when they try to access higher education. These are, broadly speaking, documentation, credit transfer, language, finance issues, and guidance. But let me provide a bit more detail on that. In all countries, refugees face a myriad of legal and administrative hurdles, not to mention the personal obstacles that can be really overwhelming and are part of the horror of displacement. Refugees only gain access to education after their status has been approved, which in most cases is a lengthy process. Accreditation for higher education study is a complex and cumbersome ordeal, and perhaps in many countries it's intentionally made that way. Competition for entry is very steep, and persisting to completion is even more challenging. That said, in my interviews with refugee students from the Syrian crisis in Germany, all of them exhibited a truly remarkable resilience, a burning desire for immediate self-sufficiency, an incredible optimism, and a really laudatory work ethic. I was humbled and deeply impressed by everyone with whom I spoke with this background. But yes, the obstacles are a great many. I specified others in a paper I wrote in 2020 for Comparative Ed Review on the Trump era and migration. Those obstacles include, so again, having to provide educational transcripts in order to register, overcoming language barriers, especially in non-Anglophone countries. For example, Germany offers language training, but it also expects a high level of competency to get into higher education, into its universities and higher ed institutions. Poor or outright lack of information about higher education pathways and opportunities is a barrier. Tuition is absolutely a barrier, especially in this country where we have much higher tuition than many other countries. And then you have related fees. You have daily living expenses, which can never be discounted. Food insecurity is something that many refugees also have to deal with, caused by the economic difficulties they have after resettling. And then I think lastly, or second to last, xenophobia in a political climate that characterizes refugees too often as terrorists and those trying to feed off of our system and not belonging here, and that puts them at daily risk. And lastly, COVID caused a further barrier, yet another barrier. Just looking at the secondary level, the UNHCR found that on average, 142 days of learning was lost. This is in their report, Staying the Course, which I urge you to read. So just to end with, as that report notes, the pandemic has given many of us a taste for what refugees refugees on a daily basis experience: isolation, restrictions on their movement, economic uncertainty, and the sudden denial of basic services. Hundreds of thousands of children are born into this year after year. That's a quote from that report. So I'll finish by saying these barriers come from many people that I work with: Susan Frotsky of Migration Policy Institute, among others, Sarah Peterson on the call, Dryden Peterson, and many others. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I just want to open it up to the panel here. Anyone else who wants to kind of take another swing at that question in terms of the barriers and maybe also some of the ways of overcoming them? Well, going once, twice, we're going to go to a question that someone submitted in registration. So Bernard, I'll address this to you, but others can come in on it too. How can university international admissions counselors best assist these refugee students in their journey to higher education?
Right. I think that's a tough issue, and I don't want to be the only one expressing an opinion on it. And in fact, I'll borrow some inspiration from Dr. Linda Abramson Evans, a lecturer at Dedman College, Southern Methodist University, who wrote us an email as a panel and really had some interesting ideas in her hopes that she wanted to express for exactly addressing this issue. So I agree with her that, for example, creating emergency accommodations for graduate and undergraduate students from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, and others could be facilitated by administrators at universities who have the infrastructure to do that. Facilitating long-term participation in university sponsorship of refugee students. That's something that I've written about and others have that we really need to focus on, the sponsorship aspect. Welcoming previously resettled refugee students who are already graduating from US high schools, getting them into the pipeline into higher ed. Identifying sources of funds to hire refugee faculty and scholars at risk, and facilitating potential sponsorship of refugee students in the categories I've already mentioned from Linda. So, I mean, I think it really comes down to a willingness and to first of all, have a humanitarian perspective on the issue, and then putting your money behind your good intentions. Thank you.
Yes. Anybody else want to come in on this?
I think Sarah has her hand up.
Oh, okay, go for it, Sarah.
I was just going to mention one example. This was a student who I knew, a Somali student who had finished their secondary education in Kenya and received their diploma of graduation, was resettled to Sweden, was immediately able to enter university for a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree, was funded for a doctorate degree. His cousin was also resettled, but just months before taking that secondary school leaving examination, and spent years trying to access higher education in Sweden. And to me, this speaks to something that I hope can be part of our approaches. We think so often in schools about differentiating instruction, like what supports do different kids need? And yet I think so often our policies around certification are just a one size fits all. If you don't check the box, it's simply not possible to move forward. And how can we think about the kinds of limitations of that on these two students had exactly the same background, they just didn't have the piece of paper. And so making the policies flexible enough to respond to that. Thanks.
Thanks. Miriam.
And I'm going to speak more about this maybe with my question, but I think what Bernhard very well did was point to the fact that we are talking about different populations, right? Those refugee students who are outside the US, and how can US higher education help increase access to higher education in the US for those students, as well as refugees already resettled here who are facing other kinds of challenges, and how can we lower the barriers for them to pursue post-secondary education, including full-time, which right now our refugee resettlement system is not set up for, actually provides disincentives for individuals to do so. So I think it's great that we're talking, kind of noting that it's not a monolithic population, but you really have to be attuned to where these students are coming from. And Sarah also kind of saying, you know, what are the specific challenges and distinctive challenges?
Okay, great, thanks. I think we'll move on now to Amy, and I'll pose my question to you. So how can community colleges help refugees get on pathways from secondary to post-secondary, certificate and degree programs that can lead to prosperous careers?
Thanks so much for asking that, Ray. And it's so good to be with everyone today. I'm glad to be able to join this illustrious group as we're discussing how critical transitions and post-secondary opportunities are that lead to rewarding careers, sustainable living wages for Afghan and Ukrainian evacuees, for all refugees. And I'm here on behalf of the Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, who is very committed to ensuring that the department provides as much support and guidance in this space as possible. I'm a senior advisor, as Ray mentioned, in the Office of the Secretary, and I'm glad to be a part of a team both across the department here at ED and across the whole of government through Operation Allies Welcome that has been focused on supporting the transition of Afghan evacuees into our country. And I've done a lot of learning about the challenges in our system, and we've built a system that is fraught with navigation challenges and silos and gaps between sectors. And as part of Operation Allies Welcome, we recognize there was such an immediate and urgent need for providing high quality, culturally responsive education to our Afghan guests, but frankly, for all refugees, inclusive of primary and secondary education, post-secondary, adult education, English language learning. And the Secretary is really committed to keeping the promise, recognizing that our Afghan allies and their families served our country and our community. We want to serve them equitably. And so first of all, happy Community College Month at the department and in the administration. We are very committed to the role that community colleges play. And when I imagine what it's like, to put myself in the shoes of an Afghan evacuee who has gone from, sudden upheaval to a safe haven and now to a resettlement community, recognizing that being uprooted from your homeland with little to nothing is such a challenge. And it's compounded by the fact that you're being separated from family and friends. You don't know whether you're ever going to return home or reconnect with loved ones. And it's just, the trauma of this is something that most of us hopefully will never experience in life. And it's unfortunate that anyone must, but as I imagine how our refugee populations are experiencing our system, we want to think about how we can make education as accessible and as inclusive as possible. And it's our civic duty, right, to ensure that we're lending a helping hand, make connections and integration into our communities, and also to honor the experience and the expertise and the skills that newcomers to our country bring, and see them through a strengths-based lens rather than just through the lens of trauma or deficit, recognizing how they bring so much that will enrich our country. So we know that education transforms lives. Our mission here at ED is ultimately to promote student achievement, prepare for global competitiveness, foster educational excellence, ensure equitable, equal access. And there's so many strategies that community colleges can and do employ to support refugee populations to get connected to career pathways. We know community colleges are the backbone of higher education in many ways in this country. They serve so many purposes, but most importantly, workforce development training and retraining for students that make up our country's workforce. And we know that our refugee students are, evacuees who are coming in from Afghanistan and now, looking ahead to those coming in from Ukraine, possess so many talents. And it's our job to help those students, recognize the talents and how they can be utilized in our country. So thinking about how we leverage existing credential attainment and help students get credentials recognized here for that use. We're learning a lot from the field about how institutions are doing things like awarding credit for prior learning and working on translating credentials earned elsewhere to the US context. And one of the largest barriers that Bernhard spoke a little to that we have heard from the field is ensuring both basic English language acquisition, but also thinking about the language of the world of work in English language. And this is a critical role that community colleges can play in getting students on career pathways. It's one thing to speak English, it's another to understand the particularities of your occupational vocabulary and vernacular needed to do that same job in the US context. So ensuring that students are connected to diverse opportunities, including things like pre-apprenticeship, registered apprenticeship, other specific vocational training and career pathways that lead to sustainable, well-paying jobs, hand in hand with really strong English language learning supports. And in the administration, we've been thinking a lot about how we ensure equitable access to powerful opportunity and what roles community colleges can play in that. So, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law is going to create millions of really great paying jobs in a range of whole different occupations and industry sectors over the next decade. And a large percentage of those jobs created through this are going to be in the sub-baccalaureate space, requiring an associate degree or an industry credential, with most jobs requiring 6 months of training or even less, which provides such a unique opportunity for community colleges to play this role in training the workforce and allowing those who are newcomers to our country to get a leg up into what will be a growing industry sector in, across our country, in rural spaces and urban spaces and everywhere in between. So we're excited that right now, more than any time in history, our community colleges are going to be and continue to directly connect students to career pathways through an array of programming. And refugee students alike can benefit from these opportunities with intentional career coaching, mentoring, and the array of services that we know our community colleges excel at and thrive at, and really meeting people where they are in their lives and helping to get them to where they want to be. So we're as we as a nation are rebuilding out of the pandemic and reimagining our education systems and how we can better support the transition from secondary to post-secondary, from post-secondary to career, integrate work-based learning throughout students' trajectories. We want to keep in mind the really unique and distinct needs and strengths that our refugee populations have in this space. So we stand at the ready to support community colleges in this work.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Amy. And let me open it up quickly, but I do also have a question for you that was submitted. But if anybody wants to jump in right away. Yeah, Laura, please.
I was just wanted to reiterate what Amy mentioned about the language of work. That's so important, and bringing it back to the industry specific. I think it's so important to understand that the ESOL classes and many of those tools that we provide through community colleges, through universities, to the different, refugees and immigrants in general, often when they're getting ready to go into employment or even to get into the market, need to also understand that they need the language for that specific industry. So it's good, to foment within your tools and with the English language classes to know that they have to be contextualized at times because they may speak English well, but they don't know the trade, their specific language. So just wanted to add that that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, thanks. Why don't I ask the question here that we had submitted with registration. So are there national scholarships, refugee education grants, or non-traditional financial aid programs that are readily available for newly arrived refugees seeking post-secondary education or certificate training? Many are eager to start their education and may have the skills. However, paying a non-resident rate or fees for a trade school is really out of the question.
So my fellow panelists and those of you in the audience probably know the landscape of available non-public funds, private scholarships and other sources of funding for higher education. With respect to federal financial aid, the good news is that very shortly the department is going to be publishing a Dear Colleague letter and also publishing our 2022-2023 FSA handbook, in which Volume 1, Chapter 2 has information specific for institutions of higher education that particular Afghan special immigrant categories are indeed eligible for Title IV student aid as long as all other appropriate student eligibility criteria are met. And so we will be providing guidance to the field with respect to federal financial aid and the categories of special immigrants that are eligible for it very shortly. And, as we consider accessibility in higher education writ large, we know that affordability is huge. I mean, we want to prevent student debt. And the administration remains committed to doubling the Pell Grant. In the president's FY23 budget that was just released, we included a $2,175 increase in our Pell budget proposal. And so we hope to be able to make such funds available to many more refugees and evacuees so that they can access higher ed, which we know is the foundation to success in our country.
Okay, thanks a lot, Amy. Unless somebody wants to jump in with a two-hander here, I think we're going to move on, okay? And so we're going to switch gears a little bit from higher education now to K through 12. And then again, thinking about the linkages here. And I'm turning now to Enia. So how have the school reforms in Afghanistan shaped the education of the Afghan children who are now resettling in the US? And will these changes ease Afghan children's transition to the US education system?
Thank you, Professor. It is a great privilege and honor to be part of this discussion. Indeed, today's subject is relevant to my personal experiences back as a refugee child, and I experienced how trauma is affecting the performance. And then lastly, particularly in the last 8 months, the incident occurred in Afghanistan, the collapse of the government. And then my family, my wife and my son evacuated, and they are with me here. And I could feel how hard and tough is that to help them with the stress, with the trauma. And I have been in communication with the other Afghans here, our evacuees. And I consider that we have the same stories and the same struggle and challenges, but with different degrees. So these are the facts that we are facing. Among the evacuees, half of the evacuees are children. They have some good educational foundation to be transferred to American schools and then to higher education, largely because of the reform that Afghanistan education system got after 2001, within 20 years of international community support in education policy, in curriculum, in teacher trainings. So in somehow, it was a reform and have positive impacts on these children. For instance, our curriculum was always been a political mean for political agendas. After 2001, the reform excluded the content that widely promoted discrimination and violence, and replaced it with the content of civic education, with the human rights education, with the environment education, and largely content added on the history and world geography, history, and also English subject added to that. So to whole, this was the reform, and I think with that system, they have some good foundation to transfer to US education system. To other side, we could not ignore the challenges. The first challenge, like every immigrant and refugees is facing, is the trauma, the horrific incident that they have been through. It is not an easy transition for them and for their families, especially when their family is struggling to find a housing, job, and they are with culture shocks, and they don't have the proper knowledge to identify the opportunity and use and utilize that opportunities to to implement their vision or what they are. But the point is that when it comes to the children, when they are in school, when they are in US schools, so they will find everything new: the building, the curriculum, the teaching process, assessment, language. Of course, they study a subject in English, but when it comes, it is a whole curriculum in English. The culture diversity and the support that is required from the family, they wouldn't receive because their families are in trauma and they need support for that. So the family wouldn't play appropriate role. So with that challenge, it rise a question: what should we do, and what might be the solution? I think psychosocial support is something that should be happen, and it should be included both for the children and for the families. And I know that the families are so much generous, the communities are so much generous here in the US. The schools are so much open for the refugees. But I think we need a state-sponsored program, a well-structured program to provide systematic support for them and to raise the resources in a more organized way, to have the program, a sort of program that could help the families to inform the families, to support their children and work with the children to fill the language gap, culture gaps, and overcome with the trauma in streets. I know it is a complex work. It is not an easy one, but still there is an opportunity for a joint partnership between the children, families, local communities, resettlement agencies, and the state to address this challenge.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eniat. Anybody want to come in on some of the things that Eniat has mentioned here? I've just got to say, in terms of the trauma, actually, before I started in my career, I worked as a mental health worker, and one of the challenges I saw it firsthand, and it's been funding to get the assistance that people need, and that's something that has often been put on the wayside. So hopefully, your call might be heeded. Any thoughts on this? Okay. Then I'm going to move on to Sarah. And Sarah, what can Americans learn from refugee education elsewhere in the world to improve US education pipelines for refugee students from K through 12 into higher education? And what roles can refugee educators play in building those pipelines?
Thanks, Ray, for this question. And it's just so wonderful to be part of this discussion and hear everyone talking both about the immense challenges, but also about these real pockets of opportunity and the kind of collective movement towards that of everyone here on this call. Like Eniat, I think my work is really going to take us into classrooms and thinking about some of these kind of relational and pedagogical dimensions of what I see as the pipeline, perhaps reflecting some of these kinds of supports and partnerships, Eniat, that you're talking about, and the varied needs and strengths, Amy, that you're talking about that refugee students and families are bringing. Miriam, I just wanted to re-echo the point you made before too, of those thinking about refugees who are resettled here, perhaps after living many, many years in exile in another country, long kind of term displacement, and then also those who are seeking access to higher education as a process of resettlement, and really thinking about the potentially different needs pedagogically of these populations. One theme I think that spans across is the work that we've been doing, as Ray mentioned, in other countries, in 23 countries, large refugee hosting countries, is this real desire for refugee education to be a process of connecting young people's pasts with their presents and their futures. And I think this echoes this point that I have heard from everyone so far, is that most refugees are not ever intending to leave their home. I mean, this is a forced experience. And so that home is not something that is meant to be left behind in creating a new process of education, but instead something that education must embrace if we are to support these kinds of pathways to success. And so I just wanted to reflect on some of the ways that we've seen educators try to support students to really bring together their past, presents, and futures that might support some of this pipeline. And I think at a very micro level, often for teachers, this means really needing to learn deeply about the experiences and identities that students are bringing to classrooms and how they're making sense of their new experiences in K through 12 and in higher education. And I've been in schools where students tell me, my teacher doesn't know where I come from. And students are often meaning quite different things by this. Sometimes it means the teacher doesn't know the name of the country. Sometimes it means the teacher knows the name of the country, but not much more than where to locate it on a map. And then many students will talk about actually what they mean is that the teacher has never asked them about what it was like to live in this place that they love, what home felt like, who was around, who were the people who were loved, what languages were spoken, what made them afraid to leave. And these kinds of conversations are so hard to have as a teacher myself, but really when we see teachers and students engage in these kinds of conversations, really developing the relationships that can be the foundation of linking the past, present, and future. And I think with some of the specifics for education, to do this in the US, of really thinking about where did prior learning happen, if it happened at all. And this really connects to what we know about refugee experiences elsewhere. Mostly long-term, people are displaced for between 10 and 20 years, so that many families who may have arrived in this country may not be coming directly from one country, but may have many stages of that kind of migration. And where did the most important learning happen? Maybe it wasn't in schools, as we might assume in the US. Were schools spaces of fear and places that were doubted or resisted for really important reasons? Was what was taught in schools, did it feel alienating? And I think these kinds of previous experiences really shaping how kids and families and young people come to education in the US. I think one particular just concrete example of this is the nature of participation in classrooms can vary so drastically from place to place. And so in working with refugee students in the US and teachers kind of asking me, I don't know why the student is not kind of contributing their ideas in class, is it a language issue? And often getting to know families who will explain, well, I've never been in a place where my opinion mattered in a school classroom, where it wasn't rude, in fact, to share what I thought or to question what a teacher might be teaching, and how we can together think about shifting these kind of rules of the game, as you were talking about, Amy, and making them really explicit, like what's expected in a US classroom? What does participation look like? Can we both respect ways in which students are bringing their participation that may look different, but also teach new ways of participation if students are interested? And just one final point, I think we're at a really important moment right now in terms of reimagining how refugees are welcomed in communities. And many people so far have also mentioned what we see right now happening with Ukrainian refugees in Europe and this kind of unprecedented stance of welcome. And I think what we've seen as a common political stance in the EU and the US has been that it's impossible to welcome large numbers of refugees. But in fact, what we're seeing right now is that it's not impossible. And so how does that help us to understand what might be possible, not just in the very neighboring space, but also where many of us sit in the US that's far away, in terms of shifting both that political rhetoric and then the actions of what it means to welcome refugee students on a really large scale. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I've got to say, just what you were saying about, the American way of teaching and education, I experienced this with my international students in undergraduate and graduate courses as well. And I think that's something that's important for us as educators not to assume that everyone does it the same way and learn a little bit about how it's done elsewhere and preface how we approach things. Absolutely. So let me open it up here if anybody wants to jump in on this. And if not, I'm ready with another question from our audience here. And this one, actually, I think it actually speaks to the issues that Enya had raised initially, but I'll direct it to Sarah, to you, and to Enya, and then anybody else who wants to jump in. So how can we help refugees overcome trauma while helping them establish themselves professionally through employment and education when there are so few community resources?
I mean, and yet I think you spoke so much to this earlier, and I think this that obviously increasing resources is essential, and access to individualized and community level supports for healing and mental health. One dimension that I think we see elsewhere in the world that I've seen less attention focused on in this dimension in the US that I think is worth keeping in mind is that in peace studies, we see this kind of differentiation between what we call negative peace and positive peace. And negative peace is the absence of direct violence, and so the kind of physical violence that one might experience. And I think what we see in refugee policies and in refugee education is that we assume that once refugees, for example, are in the US and in a school, that peace has been established. But in fact, I think what we see is that there is a continuity of the kind of violence that has been experienced that happens both with these ongoing experiences of trauma, but also because many of the kinds of community supports that would enable positive peace, which is the access to equal opportunities, are not present. And so how we think about the issues of individualized trauma also on a collective level in terms of addressing structural inequities that prevent people from actually creating the kinds of lives that they're looking to create, and instead living in an ongoing way, perhaps without acute conflict around them, but with these elements of violence that continue to affect access to opportunities.
Okay, great, thanks. Enya, do you want to jump in on this at all, or does anybody else want to come in?
Sure. I think access to information and access is a crucial thing. My personal experience, we were struggling to find accurate information, despite that there are lots of work happening. But when you come in terms of you are seeing from a refugee perspective, they are not so much mobilized to properly understand, to find information sources and then properly utilize that. And especially when there are different understanding in their home countries, when you have information, you could not make, there are perceptions, you could not change this perception easily. There are culture perceptions. Things are working different in US than in Afghanistan and other refugee countries. So these are like cultural things that how to use this information in an appropriate way. So still it is an important task, but deeply culture and how make sense of this information in a culture context. It needs some work. Still, I think that a program which psychosocial support would help them how to make work of these informations and these resources.
And if I might just say then, this question, again, it's conditioned on when there are so few community resources, i.e. if you don't have more money to throw at it, what can you do? And maybe this part about better communication of information, the information that we do have, and learning from the refugee community about what does work is something that might not cost that much. Maybe some time, but not big bucks in the budget. Yeah, Laura.
If I can add to that point about the not big bucks, the community services also thinking outside the box. Yes, we're thinking on mental support often as a direct link to a counselor, which can be expensive. And in this community, I think we have to destigmatize the field that it's not mental health. It may not necessarily be about reaching out to psychiatrists and getting medication. It may be about normalizing your feelings within your own community. And I think that's where the buck could go a little farther when we're investing in those not-for-profit organizations, those community-based, because they know the community better. They know what kind of flow has arrived and how to address mental health specific to that. And yes, eventually, you know, if there's the need for the going to the psychiatrist for the medication, but at least at first engendering that comfort level to discuss the crisis, the moment, the experience, and it costs a little bit less, I think.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, Dia.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to echo what Laura said. So here in Greensboro, for example, the New Arrivals Institute founded a group called the Afghan Women Support Group. And it's just really Afghan women getting together in a space where there's childcare so that they can talk to each other. And it could really just be as simple as that in some cases, but that grows into a support group over the years that has a lot of, I think, built-in a culturally responsive understanding of a community's needs for support.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I think did a great job on this question, folks. So with that, I think we could move on, and we're going to switch gears a little bit here again. So we've been talking about K through 12, and now we're kind of coming back to workforce development and thinking about you know, the next step after school, after college, etc. So Laura. How can higher education institutions partner with businesses and government to build professional pathways for refugees in order to meet employer demand for skilled workers?
Thank you, Ray, for that question. It's very particular. I'll be answering it on the government hat as the, you know, working for the Office for New Americans at the Department of State in New York. So first of all, again, I also want to say thank you for the opportunity to share that on behalf of the Office for New Americans and the immigrants that we serve, but also to be together with everybody here. It's really exciting getting ideas and sharing. So I will mention, as I said, on behalf of like a government entity, how can we partner and how have we been doing this to partner with higher education, some of you here present, and with businesses. I'd like to set up a little bit of background for everybody here and for those that are participating in terms of knowing what those high skill, what those workers are skilled. I don't always like to mention them as high skill because everybody has a skill to contribute. So with that focus, who are they and what are they in New York State? And I don't think it's a surprise to all of you, and especially we lived it through COVID, where we know that in New York, we're home to hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees who really have incredible skills and the professional experience required to meet what we need in terms of workforce development. We saw the nurses that are, you know, people working in cleaning up our streets. They have that skill and they gave it, but yet they are culturally systemic barriers and systemic barriers that do not allow them to access quality professional level employment. They lack familiarity around our specific norms, which is something that we addressed earlier, and Bernhard and I mentioned it. You know, these norms can be critical for them not to just get a job, but retain it. I also saw in 2016, I think LinkedIn put in a research that mentioned that about 85% of all jobs are filled via professional networking. And we know that immigrants, in particular refugees or asylees that, you know, experience sudden displacement, often find themselves without any personal and professional networks to resettle. So finally, they face, you know, significant challenges, translating even their documents, their credentials, their degrees, or even knowing how to write a resume. It's a convoluted web of licensing requirements as well for those that are not just even wanting to be a doctor, but even a nurse or a dentist, or, you know, in that here, that they had that education abroad, for example. So on the other hand, you're also facing the American employer, who is frequently unfamiliar with how to evaluate a degree, how to look at a resume that might not look like we normally have seen it, and automatically judge against it. And so this is where a role where New York State, where at least my office has tried to provide a program that can facilitate and assist in the delivery of these tools to our immigrants and our refugees. We called it Professional Pathways. It is a pilot. We're looking to learn as we've gone through the past 6-7 months with it, to learn what our strengths, how we can institutionalize it. But through it, we're addressing, you know, the credentialing evaluation. Our program is through job coaches that are establishing relationships at the very local level. We have 6 of them right now, making relationships with Chamber of Commerce, with employers in their area. So they know their community. They're very much about, we see them as experts in their area, and also with the colleges, because they need to know what courses they can take in order for them to not let their skills atrophy, if they need, for example, a credential because they want to work in a lab because they can't become a doctor, then what can the university nearby at a reasonable cost help them to get eventually in that path? So we're seeing in that path that was mentioned, I think Sarah mentioned that, or I'm not sure if you didn't or who else, that the past, present, and future. So we're looking at that present right now to see how we can get them in that future, to make sure that they didn't waste, in their emotions in choosing a career is not just a wasted, but also for New York State, it's also a skill that we need to use. We know that they contribute culturally, socially, and economically, and we want to use that. They have those skills, they have that education, that investment for us. So that's one program that, as the saying, how can we collaborate, is through building those structures that hope to have the relationship, nurturing professional paths with not only the businesses and those key members like the legislatures too at the local level, but also with the universities and the schools around it. And I'd be very remiss if I didn't mention the program that SUNY at Albany has with Governor Hochul, where they opened educational opportunity centers for refugees by waiving the residency requirement for admission. So in order for those that were not here for a year, especially the Afghan refugees, for example, were able to access those ESL courses and then the certification in order to get them local job opportunities. So these are examples, but I think it's important to recognize what are those barriers in the partnerships established, provide the tools, the relationships to be able to address and it's a lot of those barriers. But that's one example, and in addition to the one from SUNY at Albany. So you're setting the example, right?
Oh, all right. That's good to hear. Well, thanks. And actually, I think you, in a sense, answered one of the questions that had been put forward here. And I kind of, it was the gist of it is how can university ESOL programs work with other community ESOL programs to best serve resettled refugees? And it sounds like you're pointing to how these kinds of collaborations with universities and, with our equal opportunity centers that are, and also we have that they're also with our community colleges too, in SUNY. So this has been a way that's opened things. But, just quickly, when you mentioned our American employers, right? And I started thinking about that. Well, welcoming communities, we talk about, we have to meet people who are coming halfway, and don't the employers also need a little bit of training? Wouldn't it be a good thing if we think about our future employers being trained in our MBA programs to think a little bit more broadly about how they evaluate credentials and CVs, resumes. Anyway, anybody else want to get in on this topic here? No, and if not, then we're going to move on and again switch gears a bit and talk a bit more about higher education and refugees and supporting refugees more generally speaking, which incidentally is an area where we had a whole lot of our questions that were submitted. So I've got plenty for y'all. Okay. So Miriam, how does the President's Alliance help with the resettlement of refugees, and how can scholars and practitioners of refugee education contribute to these efforts?
Ray, thanks so much for putting this together. I just want to reiterate my thanks to you, and I'm so grateful to be here with everyone else. Let me say a few words about the President's Alliance and also broaden the question to what we can do collectively to meet this moment. So the President's Alliance, which was founded in 2017, is now comprised of over 550 presidents and chancellors of US public and private institutions and systems across the US. And they've come together to support undocumented, international, refugee, and other immigrant students, and to advocate alongside them for increased higher education and career access and equity, and for fair, forward-looking immigration reform. Unlike other national higher ed groups, we are singularly and comprehensively focused on that intersection of immigration and higher education. And so much of what already has been talked about is core to our mission, and it's wonderful to hear about the work. To focus on our work that's relevant to this conversation, let me talk about our actions and advocacy in 4 buckets. And I'm going to start with the campus and campus level work, some ways kind of building off of what Laura said. And one of the things she mentioned was a waiver in terms of in-state tuition to enable that recently arrived refugees and parolees could access in-state tuition. And that's key. We support advocacy to expand in-state tuition for refugees and humanitarian parolees already here so they can get better access to higher education. And in other ways to identify and to aim to lower the financial and policy barriers for resettled refugees to pursue higher education. And in fact, you can find some resources I'm going to put in the chat, resources from the Higher Ed Immigration Portal, which integrates national state level data, policy analyses, effective practices, narratives, and resources focused on undocumented refugee and international students. We have over 15 national and state level organizations already as partners and contributors to the portal, and we'd love to connect with refugee scholars and practitioners about that. A second bucket of work is that we provide technical assistance to campuses in their efforts to enroll and support refugees and humanitarian parolees. Dia is going to talk about support for refugee families. We kind of work, and I love the work that Dia is doing in complement, and we're focused really on enrolling refugees, humanitarian parolees as students. And this work is led by my colleague, Laura Wagner, who's here today. We host and share webinars and fact sheets for ongoing support for refugees in higher education. I'm thrilled what Amy says, can't wait to read that, because I think knowing what refugee and humanitarian parolees are eligible for is so important, and encouraging institutions to do the work that Laura and SUNY has been doing as well. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly newsletter to get regular updates, and you could also contact Laura directly. I'm going to put the weekly newsletter sign up and Laura's email in the chat too. Then third, and let me turn to kind of our direct work on federal policy advocacy, because I know that hasn't been discussed as much, but that's also something that's very core to the mission of the President's Alliance, and we're focused on improving existing federal policy for international students and scholars who are in the US already or who are seeking to come to the US and are impacted by conflict and other crises in their home countries. So for example, we're advocating for the administration to quickly designate temporary protected status and simultaneously announce special student relief for countries impacted by war and crisis. And further, and very importantly, streamline and clarify the processes for international students, scholars, and their families. Now, this needs to be, and I want to say this directly, an equitable process. So the administration very quickly designated TPS for Ukraine, but still has not done so for Cameroon or Ethiopia or other majority Black Muslim majority countries. Now, we applaud what's being done for Ukraine, but urge the administration to also help our students and others from Cameroon and Ethiopia. And Sarah's point is, this is great. Now we know that we can do this in a broad, expeditious fashion. Let's learn from this. So we need to grapple with the racial and geopolitical inequities and impacts of federal immigration policy. We're also working to improve the F1 visa process, and we've seen some success from this administration. I commend the administration for all that they're doing. We're also working on congressional efforts, including supporting Afghan Fulbrighters and others, and my colleague Jill Welch leads these efforts. I'll put her email in the chat as well. We really encourage individual campuses to share their priorities and experiences with us to better inform our policy advocacy. But then here's the fourth bucket, which is we need to move beyond our current policy frameworks and build new ones. For example, as Bernhard started off, the only path really open now for a refugee student outside the US is to come in as an F1 international student, which has so many barriers. So the fourth bucket is college and university sponsorship of refugee students. We've been working with many partners, including those on this call, to build the program and policy infrastructure for university sponsorship of refugee students. Let me be clear, this would be a game changer. And we are very optimistic that this is really coming. We're waiting for the policy from the State Department that will allow for private sponsorship of refugee students through a new refugee admissions category called the P4 category. I'm going to put some information again in the chat for that. And then let me end, and I'm sure I'm up to my 5 minutes, but with the forthcoming action we'd love to share with you. So in the coming weeks, the President's Alliance plans to release a call to action on supporting refugee and displaced students and scholars that will include some of the policy asks that I referenced here. And it's going to be open to sign on by institutional and organizational leaders. I think we need to underscore the urgency for action in this pivotal moment and continue to mobilize higher education leaders and campuses to meet the moment. And I'd love your help in spreading the word. And let me stop there.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we'll make sure to spread the word on that. We will indeed. So anybody want to jump in here, react to anything here? Otherwise, we'll move to Dia. And like I said, there are a lot of questions for both of you too on this front. Okay, Dia, so what opportunities can colleges offer to refugees, and what can refugees offer college students in terms of experiential education?
Thank you. And I will definitely use your students who are doing some wonderful work on the feasibility study as an example of student engagement in this. So I'm Dia Abdo, and I am a professor at Guilford College, which is a small Quaker school in Greensboro, North Carolina. And in 2015, I was minding my business as, teaching literature to students who are either reading or not reading the novel that I had assigned, depending on the day, when the Syrian refugee crisis, of course, erupted. I'm the daughter of Palestinian refugees. I was born and raised in Jordan, and I came to this country on an F1 visa. So I'm remember those days very well, in the days of advanced parole, when we had to ask permission to go visit our families while we were studying. So yeah, when the crisis erupted, I was really struggling, like I think many of us, with what to do with our institutions and how we can support refugees. And I was really inspired by Pope Francis, who called on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family. And I thought his invocation was truly remarkable, because he was asking small communities to carry that responsibility of welcome, right? Not countries, small communities. And I really see colleges and universities exactly like that, where small communities, just like a parish or a city, and we have everything that you can imagine, right? Housing, cafeteria, clinics, to support refugees in ways that cities do. And so I founded in 2015 Every Campus a Refuge, and ECAR for short mobilizes college and university resources really to act as welcoming places for refugee families. And so what an ECAR campus does, or calling it Resettlement Campus does, is provide free temporary transitional housing to refugee families who are arriving into the local area, and then campus-based integration support that's provided by students, by faculty, by staff who are vetted and trained to provide welcome and integration to the hosted family. And families really range from, large families with children, or couples, or singles, depending on who is being hosted on campus at that time. This, of course, is done as a sort of a co-sponsorship model with a local refugee resettlement agency. So I want to say that beyond the facilities and the amenities, right? So a family is provided with housing on campus. As I said, it's free temporary housing. Usually that's underutilized housing that's being leveraged for something like this. Access to facilities that help folks thrive rather than simply survive. And I think that also speaks to better employment. So for example, we hosted an artist on Guilford's campus. Guilford has been hosting refugees now on its campus for 7 years. We've hosted 80 refugees. We're currently hosting 16 Afghan evacuees. And there are several other campuses who are doing this work. One of the guests that we hosted was an artist. And while he was on our campus, he had access to the art department, to art supplies, and then we exhibited his work on our in our art gallery, and his artwork was picked up by a gallery downtown, and now he does work by commission. So this allows him to supplement his income. They bought a home, which is wonderful, especially in this kind of environment where it's really impossible to do that. And so this initial period of free hosting, you all know that refugee resettlement is built on the self-sufficiency model, right? Like, so 90 days, you're supposed to achieve self-sufficiency, but allowing folks to have more than 90 days to breathe, settle in, not have the financial stress, means a greater chance at financial stability and a greater chance at finding employment that is more suitable, because there's more time to get recertified and there's more time to learn English. But in terms of what this can offer our students, so as you can imagine, it started off really as a hosting initiative. And then, of course, our students were engaged. So on a very basic level, this is service learning, right? But it's on our campus instead of in the community. But then we developed a minor. So there's a curricular component now where at Guilford College, students can actually get credit for doing this work and hosting refugees on a campus. And campuses that don't have minors, they have courses where students get credit. And they sign up for that course, and then they get credit for supporting the family. Our most recent chapter is Old Dominion University, and the person who's coordinating the effort is a graduate assistant. And so this is her GA-ship. So imagine the experience of supporting a refugee family, providing casework, case management, but also coordinating and learning so much about refugee resettlement as part of your GA-ship, the kind of sort of training that allows that student to have. Your students are a wonderful example. They're also doing a feasibility study on how Albany could be such a place for supporting refugees on campus and supporting them in their resettlement. I want to give a couple of examples of the ways in which I found students to be transformed by this initiative. So we've had students who have been volunteers, of course, they're trained, and then they've gone on in careers that support and advocate for refugees, whether it's refugee or immigration law. We actually have one of our students who now is the director of a refugee support organization. And then most recently, I've heard from a college in New York, and the reason that they reached out to me because they want to start an ECAR chapter on their campus is because the woman's son is a student at the ECAR chapter in Siena College. And he's so transformed by that experience that his mother felt that this thing that happened to him has so changed him that it must be just so wonderful. And they want to do something similar on their campus. So I guess I want to say that it's really truly transformative. It's a sort of place-based experience, a kind of study away at home, global engagement at the local level that allows us to provide a welcome and integration support to a family, while we also sort of provide our students with a robust experience in refugee resettlement at the local level.
Okay, thank you so much. And unless folks want to jump in on anything, I'll give you an opportunity. But if not, then I've got a bunch of questions, and I want to ask you also to take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions that you want to pull out and answer as well. But keep in mind that in terms of our audience, we have a good share of it are actually from the University at Albany. Then we have a broader group of people from other SUNY campuses, and then, all across the country, and a few international too, all right, that who had registered. But starting off with the question that's closest to home, I guess. So beyond monetary donations, what can an average member of the University at Albany community do to help refugees? And, I put that, I've got, I was thinking that Dia, Miriam, and Enya might be the folks I'd ask anyway to take a stab at that one. Anybody else can chime in. Go ahead.
So I could,
Yeah.
yes. So I want to give an example from our Old Dominion University chapter, our most recent chapter. It's an R1 institution, public institution in Virginia, and they're currently hosting a Syrian family of 6 on their campus. And they have an English language acquisition program that has designed an English course specifically for this family. The father is an electrician, and so they're going to work on functional English to support his career in electricity. And I mean, that is just such, I think, a great way that campuses can offer, people can offer support beyond the donations, right?
Yeah.
I think always find ways to respond to community identified needs. In this case, it's the need for English language acquisition or whatever it is, and then, get together a group of people who might be able to offer some kind of support in terms of, whether it's recertification or English language, even, conversations, tutoring, things like that.
So this is a way that faculty, for example, who, you're in the English department, so you have an English example, but faculty who might, and it could just be that kind of conversation, working on conversation, and then maybe bringing in, I'll get my electrician, for example, to come and have a chat, right? So those are very simple ways that we could do it. Yeah, Anya.
I think thanks for them that they show interest and willingness to help the refugees. Of course, they can do much important, especially with the culture exchange, which is important for a refugee, having like participation in the society, being part of the society, and understanding the culture thoroughly. So this is somehow interaction between the cultures, and yeah, of course, whether it is student or a member of the U Albany, they could at least link with a one refugee family and could have meetings with them, introduce the culture, learn from their culture. They have lots of things to share, and they would have lots of things to learn. So I think this might be a worthy and enriched culture exchange, and will help, of course. I know how much it is helpful for a family for a refugee to feel like engaged in the society.
Great. Yeah, Miriam, do you want to?
Ray, I'll just say just a few things, and I put them in the chat too. So,
Okay.
One of the things is that campuses can identify scholarship opportunities, both for those who are already in the US as well as those outside the US. There's Student Voices for Refugees Network, and I put in their toolkit. And I think just in general, what every campus can do is highlight the stories of those immigrant and refugee and international students and scholars and staff members who are on your campus. Get to know who's part of your campus, whether an alumni letter, whether it's part of your campus, and that can really uplift. Look at all these individuals who are part of our campus community, and the more that we can do.
Okay, yeah, and again, this is something that we all could do, just thinking about our own departments, and just, again, it's another part of information, just being open to remembering and highlighting it. No, that's great. Let me take another step, and the question here, again, the University at Albany is a part of the State University of New York, 64 campuses serving upstate and also Long Island, and this includes the community colleges, our universities, and our four-year comprehensive colleges. And we also have in Albany a SUNY system, right, the kind of the headquarters for the whole enterprise here. And incidentally, collectively, we are one of the largest universities in the country. All right. Question here is, how can we help at the SUNY system administrative level? So we got a question from HQ. What can they do to help? And that one, I think maybe, Miriam, you might be able to chime in, because I think you deal with both the kind of the chancellor level and campus, and perhaps Laura, you might have some thoughts on this as well.
Sure. And, one of the things, again, building on what Amy and Laura are already talking about, really being aware of the types of support that refugees and parolees as eligible non-citizens can have for federal financial aid, but doing all that you can also to increase access to state, in-state tuition and in-state aid. I think that's one thing as an advocacy that kind of both practical, but also advocating. One of the things also is that, full-time students lose some benefits if they're humanitarian parolees. And I think we need to hear from campuses also on behalf of their full-time enrolled humanitarian parolees. So there's a type of advocacy that can be done at the system level that can be really helpful. And let me stop there.
Okay.
If I can add, I think it's crucial, the advocacy part. I mean, we saw it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, as we were starting to face closures with the border and closures with certain countries, where the systems, the universities, several across the country, really got on and voiced in defense of the students that were here being threatened to have to, within the Muslim ban, for example. That was one of the very first times that I had seen that openness, that advocacy. And for my office, it was very important to rely on that too, because we provide legal support, and we knew that we were watching to see what the consequences were so that we could train our attorneys or their attorneys to put them in the defense of a body that normally we didn't have to, students. So, we were focused on the other immigrant visas and benefits. And that was one that we felt, well, they have the visa student, the university is going to defend them. When that was at risk, we needed to come in. So it was really great to rely on that advocacy. So continued when it comes up to those situations, because we do have at least that relationship too with our network of providers. Now, granted, New York is unique in that strength of that defense and the attorney provision, but other states are coming with those defense mechanisms as well, or advocacy mechanisms that students do need. They do need at risk, because the visa for a student, as what's been discussed today, is no longer, the one that they can use when we have crises in Ukraine and Afghanistan. They need to file for other applications in order to stay, because they don't have the choice anymore to go. So there is that kind of new realization that our students also need that defense. So it's great to see that. And I just wanted to also mention, in terms of what else can the universities do. I mentioned earlier about the breakage in networking and their ability to have contacts. I think, Ray, you've been an example in a lot of ways for this, is to take on those individuals and nurture their networking in a system, and be able, the university, to help those students get to know community members, get to know, mentor with a professional that can help them as they move forward and they're starting to get into the employment. I think that's so crucial, to make sure that they know people, that they know, in reference to what I mentioned earlier about LinkedIn saying that 85% of jobs come about as a result of that. So with that angle, I think mentoring those students is really important. So there's programs within the universities that can take on them to provide those linkages, it would be great.
Okay, great, thanks. So Bernhard, some ideas for what SUNY can do? Advin?
Well, rather, I have put something in the chat that just puts a plug in for an initiative we've got at GW that one of the students on the call today, Olivia Issa, and others are running. We are trying to do something to bring at least one refugee student, but hopefully many more, to our campus. And, it takes a will. And I mean, I'm thinking of today's political environment. There are people who can come up with 100 excuses for why not to help, but there are just as many good reasons to do something. And we really all have the capability and capacity at universities to help. So this initiative called the Welcoming Campus Initiative proposes helping refugees come to our campus through scholarship support, admissions support, social support, and local partnerships. And this is all explained in the link I put in the chat. It's just one way of trying to help, but it's out there.
Okay, great, thanks. I've got a question that actually came in one of our later registrants, but I think it's a good one. And I think this is probably Dia, Miriam, and Bernhard, and anybody else whose campus has been working on this. All right, I work at a university that's starting to plan to recruit refugees as employees. For those who have already started this, what are the challenges you faced, and what valuable lessons have you learned in the process? So, I mean, I'm not aware of at UAlbany, I mean, we may, have employed refugees, but not in a systematic manner that I'm aware of. But I don't know if that's something that has occurred at anybody else's campus.
Ray, one of the things, and I'm not quite sure whether they are also talking about humanitarian parolees, because I know, especially with Operation Allies, the kind of to welcome Afghans, that's something that we've certainly encouraged campuses not only to think about supporting Afghan families, enrolling Afghan parolees and SIVs and so on, but also as staff members. And this goes back to Amy, and I turn to, Amy, this is another role that community colleges can play. If you want to
Absolutely.
say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's an important point here, is that the Afghan people on humanitarian parole, it might take a little while, but they will get work authorization. And it's important for all employers, including universities, to know that here is, and especially in the labor type market that we're in, here's a pool of labor that can really contribute. Okay, anybody else on unemployment? Okay, well then I'm going to kind of stay with this theme a little bit here. And this is probably good, a question for Laura and Amy. What is being done to find employment for skills the refugees already possess? And how can university career services begin cultivating resources to better assist refugees with preparing to go on the market? I think to some degree that you've answered some of this in all the way, but if you have some more thoughts on that.
Amy, do you want to go ahead, or I can?
After you, Laura, jump right in.
So, okay, so again, yes, I've addressed a little bit of what we've been doing in terms of that program that I mentioned to you, the professional pathways. When it was originally, we were planning it, we didn't have the population of the Afghan community here yet, the AOWs, but it came very perfect for that in a sense. So what I can say is that program has been working in conjunction and together with our refugee resettlement agencies across New York State to provide them with the credentialing evaluation, to provide them with the training, and then they also connect them to employment. So it's been, that's really has been one of those tools in which we are allowing them to get employment. We have, it's only been a few months, a 6-month program, but we know that we've employed already 50. But it's important, the credentialing evaluation is really a key. And that's many of the AOWs right now, the Afghan community have gained employment through that program. Another program that we have, and I think this is something that is used by many across the country, is navigators who are sharing information, sharing on what exists. And they are really key to connect the universities, to let them know about programs at their local level with the resettlement agencies, with others, in terms of boosting their their ability of knowledge of what employments exist. They have relationships with not just with the business providers, but also with the chambers of commerce, as I meant, and with community colleges. So part of their charge is to know the landscape and connect that and providing those tools. And I hope I answered that question.
Laura, what you were saying is where I was just about to go, which is that, as Ray said, like, we are in this very tight labor market, right? And employers really, are in need of talent and skills that many refugees and parolees have. And so I think there is a role for our institutions of higher education to be sure that you're working closely with your local workforce development boards, your local chambers of commerce, and other employer associations to be clear on what are the skills and credentials that are in demand in your region, but also to help both employers and folks who are in the workforce development and training side of things really understand the immense strength and skills and experiences that refugees, evacuees, parolees bring with them. And so like the role of translation of skills to credentials is one obviously that higher ed can play on a whole bunch of fronts. And a lot of those decisions, I think about bridging the non-credit to credit divide in community colleges writ large for any student, but especially for newcomers to our country, refugees, evacuees, parolees, like how do we ensure that IHEs are really helping students understand like how they can broker their skills in our labor market in this country. And I really, would encourage higher ed to think about the role that it can play in being a bridge to the different players in the ecosystem that will be essential for, both employers getting the talent they need, but really for this population that we care so much about from an equity lens, being able to navigate the labor market.
Okay, great, thanks. You know what, we're coming close to the end of our time, but there's one question that came, and this, we could leave it broadly, but maybe Miriam, you might want to address it. So what are tips and tools for when everyone is not on board?
So I love what, I'm going to go back to Bernard said, don't let it overwhelm you. We're not asking you to do everything, do one thing. And well, if you have the chat, we can put in the chat again, that toolkit for trying to get folks on board. That's one of the reasons why we created that toolkit of what are some of the conversations that you can have with, on campus to get people aware. This is supporting refugee students is at the core of the higher education mission of equity, access, social mobility, and more. So we're in a good place in some ways starting off, but also to recognize that there are competing commitments and not to just say, oh, they're so resistant, but let's take some time to understand some of those competing commitments and what's one step we can take.
Okay, thank you very much. And our time has come to an end. And I want to thank you all for sharing all of your knowledge and insights with us all. I want to thank the audience, all of you who came and those of you who sent in your questions. And I just want to say is that we will be sending out a report we do of this meeting. We'll have some resources. We'll kind of pull a lot of things together into that. And post the video for those who may not have been able to come. So folks that in your organization who couldn't make it but are still interested can watch. And also, I just want to make a quick plug, and I'll also send that out to everyone who is registered, that there is a big, all morning long panel that's being hosted by Rutgers University in 2 weeks, all right, on Friday. And I'll send that all out to you so you'll be able to get a hold of it. And with that, I'm going to bring the formal roundtable to a close. Thank you all. And if anyone does want to stay on board, I'll hang out and chat with folks who are in the audience here. Thanks a lot.